Right now is former Republican Congressman Denver Riggleman. I'm going to get to that, but first I want to ask you about the breaking news regarding the Biden administration allowing Ukraine now to use long-range U.S. missiles to strike into Russia. What is your reaction to that?
Well done. I was just in Ukraine. I got back last month. Alex, I probably should have told you, some other time. But yeah, I was just in Ukraine, and I think this is a fantastic opportunity and a fantastic decision to project power against Russia. And I think it's a fantastic decision. It's hard for me, to go into all the variables right in that decision making. But in these last 2 months, before Donald Trump is inaugurated, I think it's this time right now that we need to make sure that Russia understands what that pushback is as they're trying to make way and take more territory in Ukraine.
Okay, well, so you were in Ukraine. Give me a sense of what the feeling is about the war right now and where it stands. How badly do Ukrainians want it to end? How do they want it to end? When do they want it to end? I mean, what are the circumstances around all of that?
Sure. And Alex, had the good fortune to meet so many individuals and some that were directly involved in combat. I got to look at specific types of drones. I got to look at the intelligence that was being pushed from the front lines. Again, I was very fortunate to see that, and I understand it. I was a military officer, but I was a mission planner. I was in intelligence. So what I saw there was still this incredible resolve. I don't think they want the war to end unless Russia is pushed all the way out of their territories. But that was the fear that was expressed to me, that if Donald Trump were to win, what does that do for future funding? And what does that do for their ability to push back against Russia's ability to scale their armaments much quicker than Ukraine? So those are some of the things that I got to see. I also got to see some of the ways that they were tracking Russian military assets. It was incredibly novel. And I think the U.S. could actually learn from them. And I would think that we would want to have a bigger presence there as far as advisors, but actually learning from the Ukrainian armed forces and how they're attacking Russian assets.
Can this be a game changer, though? Can Ukraine win with the use of U.S. long-range missiles?
It's a great question. I think in 2 months, it's going to be very difficult to win. I do think it gives them some time and space for better negotiations when Trump comes into power. But we don't know what Donald Trump's going to do. I mean, he has stated that he's going to end the war as quickly as possible, which doesn't really bode well for Ukraine. And that really does, I think, suggest a brokered peace on territory already taken, which is a massive fear of the Ukrainians. But I think what we need to do right now is we need to deplete as much of the Russian military actions as we can. And over the next 2 months, that could give the Ukrainians a leg up on any negotiations going forward.
And listen, that's the way Volodymyr Zelensky said. He would like to see the war end. Of course, it would have to be done diplomatically. He believes under the incoming administration it might be done more quickly. This based on a phone call that he had with Donald Trump just this week. How do you see it ending? I mean, would it be diplomatically?
Alex, there's so many variables because, I know we're going to talk about the picks in the Trump administration, the lack of competence that I see coming in the DNI and SecDef space. But what I do think that Zelensky is going to be faced with, I think with Donald Trump, is he's going to be faced with a territorial issue and how much territory he's willing to give up. And I think that's the fear that they have. So, yeah, there could be a brokered peace quickly. But again, it comes down to what is Zelensky going to accept as far as territory, or is he just going to accept that all of Ukraine needs to be returned for there to be some kind of peace? And that's going to be very interesting going forward. It's going to take a lot of talent in the foreign policy space, but also in the military space to make sure that we have an agreement that the U.S. can live with, because, we are a member of NATO, and there are issues and cascading effects based on what Russia is able to acquire in Ukraine.
Yeah, look, I do want to talk about those picks, and I hope we're going to have time to do it. But I want to first ask you about the NBC News reporting about the Trump transition team exploring possible court-martial for current and former military officers that were involved in the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Again, as a former Air Force officer, and you've described your role there, what sort of charges could these current and former members of the military actually be charged with, not just threatened, but actually be charged with, as they were following the orders of the president to withdraw forces?
Yeah, it's interesting. My first, I believe, is going to be dereliction of duty. I think that's what he's going to go after him with, because that's sort of an all-encompassing charge. And also, my guess is they're going to be offered some type of non-judicial punishment initially, which every general and every officer will turn down. They'll demand a court-martial. I think what people don't understand is there's a cascading effect here, that if Donald Trump does go after military officers, they're going to bow up. You're not talking about shrinking violence. I mean, heck, if you come after me, I'm going to demand a court martial, and I'm going to demand that it be televised. I want it as public as possible. I want people to see when you politicize the military and you have an individual who's gone absolutely rogue against people who've served this country. So I think what they need to be worried about is there's a lot of military officers and a lot of enlisted folks out there, because I was both. I was a Mustang, I was enlisted and then an officer, who's going to push back. And even if they voted for Trump or they were a supporter of Trump and they see what's going on this court-martial issue, I think you can have some military people say enough of this nonsense. So again, I think they have to tread carefully, but I do know there's going to be tens of thousands of military officers that rise up in support of any general or any senior ranking officer that's tried in any way in any tribunal.
So you're saying you could conceive of dereliction of duty because it is broadly based. Would someone in leadership, would they be deserving of that charge being brought against them?
Be very difficult. I mean, you're talking about something, if they're following orders from a commander in chief, you're going to have to prove down the line that what they did was outside their orders or in such dereliction of duty, right, that they actually caused life or death or things of that nature in a very difficult situation. But that's the thing about the military, is you have to make those decisions in real time. And that's the thing that I fear the most, Alex, right, is that we're going to have people that are stooges of the incoming government that's going after military officers who had to make very difficult decisions. And if you haven't served in the military, if you don't know the stress and the pressure or the fact that you have to make life and death decisions in an instant, you might have individuals, right, that want to bring these charges. And obviously in a court martial, you're going to have other military officers or a jury, their peers actually doing this. But again, it comes down to who are those peers, who is going to be selected. And I can't imagine there's any ethical officer that would sit on a court martial and actually judge based on these circumstances at this time. And, you know, my guess is, and here's what I would like to ask Alice, is Mike Flynn going to be court martialed? Because that's the one that I would like to see. So is this what we're going to do? Are we going to go after Mike Flynn and the officers that already had Russian collusion and had felonies or were pardoned? So these are, let's see how they do. Let's see if they're actually equal in that type of justice. And I doubt they're going to be. This is absolutely a military officer witch hunt.
Okay. Thank you very much, Denver. I'm sorry we're not going to be able to get to Trump's cabinet picks, which means I'll have to see you again soon. We'll get to it then. Thank you, my friend.
That's right.